Okay, hello everybody. It is Thursday, January 26th, and this is the OLM working group and issue triage meeting. So on today's agenda, we're going to go over the existing milestone 2 proposals. As we discussed last week, it's split into 2 parts, milestone A and milestone 2B. We'll probably just change those to milestone 2 and milestone 3 at some point, and they will be able to be done in parallel because they revolve around work that doesn't really associate with each other. So I want to go over milestone 2A, which is a bit more fleshed out than where we left it last time, and this will be the opportunity for people to move it in a different direction before I create the GitHub issue later. And we'll still be able to change it once it's there, but it's nice not to completely do away with it once we have it listed as a milestone goal. So milestone 2A, it's a bit of a rough draft, but it's the OLM V1 release process, and there's really 2 goals that we want to accomplish. The first of which is, as an OLM V1 developer, we want to easily cut an OLM V1 release, and likewise, as a cluster admin, I want to be able to install an OLM V1 release easily, ideally with a single command. And so, at a high level, what does this look like? We're basically trying to make sure we can cut a release of OLM and that people can use it relatively easily, because it will promote frequent feedback as people go and play around with it as we cut new releases. Some of the components that we're going to have to think about when we cut an OLM V1 release are the operator controller, RucPack, Cert Manager. These 3 projects are absolutely needed right now to install the milestone 1. And then as we address milestone 2B, there's going to be a new catalog source project, and we're probably going to need to pull that in as well. So it's not necessarily blocking for this milestone, but if we get to a point where the second milestone is completed and we have the new catalog source API and the controller associated with it, we can suddenly just make sure it's part of the release process. But that can be added on later if we finish this one first. So some of the things that we want to do are listed down here, and I'll very quickly just kind of run over each of them. But like I said earlier, OLM V1 is built up of a bunch of sub projects like RucPack, the operator controller, and possibly Cert Manager. So we're going to need to basically have a release process for each of those sub projects defined. We don't have to worry about what Cert Manager's release process is. We don't have to create our own release process for them. They already have their release process, so we have to figure out how we integrate with their release process. We already have a working release process for a RucPack, and we talk about that in this little action item. And finally, we'll probably have to just make sure whatever release process we use for RucPack, we're using a similar one for the operator controller. And the goal is simply so that if we edit one of the release process for like operator controller or for RucPack, it's easy to transfer to the next or the other project, and it just makes it consistent. So as if you learn how to release one of the projects, you're able to release the other project. So less process work that we have to keep track of. This next ticket relies on the previous ticket being met, but basically once we have the structure defined, we need to actually make sure that a release is cut for each of the sub projects for the OLM V1 milestone 1 demo, right? So we're going to get the operator controller project to a state that it can install and uninstall operators, and we're going to need to cut a tag, and then we're going to make it so that we install that, we install RucPack, and Cert Manager. So each of those releases that we're going to use need to be cut and available for use in the next 2 tickets. So this ticket just kind of defines that we need a GitHub repository to store the various OLM V1 releases. There's some ambiguity as to whether it's going to end up in the OLM repository that exists today, or if we will put it in the operator controller repository. Right now, we'll probably just throw this in a developer-owned repository, and we'll create a general availability issue to track the need to find the final resting place. So once we have that, we have a place to cut an OLM V1 release, and that means we need to update the repository to have a way well, we first have to define what an OLMv1 release is going to look like. We are then, we first have to define how we're going to map an OLMv1 release to each of the subcomponent versions. We're then going to have to make sure that we have a defined format for what the release assets are going to look like in that GitHub release. Something that's probably key is the ability to install that version of OLM with a single command line command. And then we will probably want to automate that script so that we can push a tag, cut the release, and then finally, we should cut the OLMv1 milestone one release. And so if we look backwards, we want to be able to cut an OLMv1 release. That means we have to have a place to store those releases. If we're cutting a release, that means each of the sub projects have to have a version that we're using. And then finally, we just have to have a common structure so that it's easy to maintain going forward. And finally, we have one last process, which is just documenting the release process. So that means we have some guarantee that we're going to cut a release for each milestone at least. And then we have that GA milestone issue that Anik recommended, which is, hey, before we hit our general availability, we are going to commit to releasing projects, with this cadence. Because we won't be as milestone driven possibly at that point. And that concludes my quick review of the first milestone we'll be pursuing, which focuses on distribution. Are there any questions, concerns, comments? I'll open the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had one. So just out of curiosity, you mentioned you touched upon this on the fact that all the artifacts or all the manifests from all of the sub projects will be contained in a singular project in GitHub. I think that caught me. Did we discuss why we want them to be in GitHub? Is there any advantages, or is it just everything is in GitHub, so this is how we need to release? Does it tie into other release processes, upstream, downstream? How did we reach there? What's the to give you a context a little bit, like for example, the way that where I'm coming from is we've been shipping bundles, for example, right, through image container registries, and there's some conversations starting up regarding shipping bundles using OCI artifacts. And this OCI artifact shipping mechanism is how, for example, a lot of the Helm charts are being shipped nowadays, a lot of the artifacts. And it seems like shipping the manifest for different sub projects also fits into this. And I wish Joe was here, because Joe was the one who was sort of first excited about this OCI artifact shipping mechanism. So that's where I'm coming from. Before I sort of think in that direction, I wanted to know why that GitHub was solidified, or if it's set in stone and there is no way, like once we start the release process, it's going to be a huge pain to migrate that off of. You get all the manifests from GitHub versus we have them shipped as OCI artifacts. So we have our own tool, or maybe you can use one of the OCI artifact tool to pull it from a registry and download it, which is, or maybe even, like if you have Opera SDK, install OLM v1.0.1, and I'll just pull in the OCI artifacts and install those manifests instead of using a GitHub.
Yeah, so great question. So I don't think it's like, so I just want to speak to what I'm looking at. Maybe I should have added links. So if you look at, repository, what I'm talking about when I say we cut a release and we have manifest is if we look at what Ruckpack looks like, they have a Ruckpack YAML that we can apply, and it's just here. I don't think I'm married to doing this. I would be just as happy if we had, like if part of this GitHub action, we cut an OCI image that pushed up an image that had all the manifests and applied it. It's effectively the same thing. I would leave that up to the developers to kind of decide, but I would like to see us to continue to do per repo a release version, and then whatever the format for tying from this thing to the underlying how would I phrase it, the YAMLs that we want to apply, right? It could, you could do it by attaching an asset here that has, that you just apply. Alternatively, like you had suggested, we could, take the repository name, push it to Quay or something, and then like tag it with the correct version, right? And then so each version, when you cut a release, would map to an image with a version. And then, the installation script would simply be like, what is the latest or what is the release? And that maps to, the image name and tag. So I'm pretty open to anything. I would leave that to whomever is implementing this to decide. And maybe we can work on improving so I think the part that you're talking about is right here.
Yeah, I think that answers my question. I mean, I was mainly, so we're still sort of very early on in our exploration about the OCI artifacts release manifest distribution process. But I mainly wanted to know if we are really, if there's any reason that we are sticking to GitHub, or if there's any way for us to sort of explore other options. I mean, obviously it has to be quality of life improvement reasons that we take on different release processes. But I think the answer that I'm taking away is yes, if there are other ways that we can, make things easier for us, it is available to us.
Yeah,
to explore.
totally. Do you mind if I just kind of throw this down as an implementation detail and say this format could be built around found here, and then alternatively, each sub component could be released as a we could build an OCI image for containing the YAML for each subcomponent, and simply pull them down. Something like that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because ultimately I don't really care how we do it. All I know is that GitHub has some like nice GitHub actions where if I think I want to use GitHub to store our code, right? And I think there are some nice GitHub actions you can make that if you push a tag, you cut a release, and then the script that cuts the release, it just needs to produce the stuff that we want to install in a way that allows us to install the component at that version, right? And whether or not that's like stored as a YAML as an asset in the GitHub release, or if it's pushed as an image that we can then pull down and apply to the cluster. Honestly, I would leave it to the developers to make that decision, because they're the ones that are going to maintain it, right?
Yeah, no, I think we already released like at the end of the day, I think that makes me think that we already do release OLM image, right? So if we do decide to store these in GitHub, and the reason that I say this is because like I think we started storing these artifacts in GitHub mainly because that was the only storing mechanism for us. And Git clone gave us the nice ability to just get these manifests by using the Git CLI tool. But with new storage mechanism, I think we have other avenues for us to explore. But you're right, like there are some. Git also has a kind of expanded since few years ago, and now we've got nice GitHub Actions, so we could just even if we do decide that we have an entire repository just to store manifests, at the end of the day, there could be GitHub Actions that builds these OCI artifacts, OCI images that has OCI artifacts in them. So we could have, yeah, we could have both of them using GitHub Actions, so that's not a bad idea too. But it's good to have these kind of noted down so that.
So Anik, I am sorry, I might have miscommunicated something. I am definitely not suggesting that we like print out the manifest versions per like we do in OLM right now, where we have a deploy folder and then like, or it's like upstream deploy and then v0.0.1, v0.0.2. What I'm suggesting is just like, this is part of the release payload. So like this is what I'm talking about when I say like we print them. If you like, these are assets, they're not in the repository itself, like as like a Git thing, like it's not going to be we're not going to duplicate this mess. It's just when you cut a release, the GitHub action would generate all the manifests for that release, and then that's connected to this as an asset, and then there's like some mapping mechanism that says, hey, for the rec compat component, install this thing from this release.
Right. So in the and then in the, for example, the statement, you have a statement that says now we need to kind of define what OLM v1 means, and that means the combination of all the manifests from all the sub projects.
Right.
Is that repository also going to look something like? Is that repository not just a combination of all the manifests put together in folders, like how you showed we have in OLM right now, or is that?
No, I was thinking like a YAML file that has a key, like a key for version, like, so it'd be like, and we could do anything, like this is up to the developer, there just needs to map, but like key is OLM v1 milestone 1, and then the individual components are listed as key in the map, so it'd be like ruckpack, operator controller, cert manager, and it would point to, and like some script would look at that, say, okay, for this release, I grab these assets, and what we're putting in that like release for OLMB1 is just a script that looks at that file and installs all the stuff. Like there would be no manifest stored in the repo. But like I'm thinking like we would basically have a single asset. We would have, so just to kind of paint the picture, this would be like OLM v1 v0.0.1, and then there'd be a similar box right here that says like installation, and what that installation box would look like is this one command, like curl. This would point to a script, and that script would know how to take that mapping file and install each of these subcomponents.
Okay, so that makes, and then as a part of the release artifacts, I mean, I'm guessing it'll be 1.0.1. So when we see that release of 1.0.1, there'll be, as a part of the release artifacts, there will be the manifest from all the subcomponents.
We could do that. Like we could even just say like, hey, we only provide like, for the ruckpack version, we just give them this link. And then, you can reference an asset that's in here, like this ruckpack.yaml, and it will just apply it. Like that could be in the script, right? Like you could just say in the script, apply HTTPS GitHub operator framework ruckpack release tag v0.11/ruckpack.yaml. And that would install ruckpack.
Right. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think we've gone a little deeper than we needed to in this meeting, but I appreciate the conversation, I think.
Yeah, no, and the developer at the end of the day can decide what the payload increase. Like if they want to like generate the manifest in the release for each of the subcomponents and just apply it, that's fine. If we want to reference, the actual releases for each of the subcomponents, that's fine. I would just need to have like I would expect the engineer to critically think about, the benefits of both approaches and then decide on one.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Okay, cool. And I think on that, any other questions people want to raise?
I was thinking during this conversation, I was wondering, is there a reason we can't just do like a release YAML file, just like is in like Ruckpack for OLM v1, but instead we have like a concatenation of all the release YAML files from say like Ruckpack, depi, catalog source controller, whatever the different components are that's going to make up OLM v1, and it's just one YAML file that has all their assets and everything that needs to be installed already pinned to a specific version. And we can create like a script to build that manifest. But then somebody can just use, like if someone wants to install OLM v1 on their cluster, they just have to do kubectl apply -f and then the link to that release manifest for that particular version of OLM v1. And then it will automatically install Ruckpack, whatever the different things that are in there are.
Yeah, so I think that's perfectly reasonable as well. I think there are some gotchas if we go down that route that I would just like to highlight now. And one of which is if you install, like Ruckpack depends on Cert Manager right now. And if Cert Manager isn't working at the time that Ruckpack is installed, it doesn't heal on its own. And so using a script allows us to introduce like arbitrary waits until certain conditions are met. So that's like a benefit of using a script. But at the end of the day, I'm totally open to also generating those manifests so people can view, the individual, like the stuff they're actually going to end up installing on their cluster, right? Like I think that's a visibility thing people will appreciate. So I think printing, all the assets that will get installed makes sense. One other nice thing about this script is if we go down the path of, setting up some CI for integration testing, we can actually provide overrides for each of the subcomponents, and then you could set up the PR to install specific versions of like the latest for each of the versions, or have some configurable aspect. I'm not sure what it would look like, but you could imagine that like we just swap out the image of the stuff that we apply, and as part of the CI toolchain, we build a image of, let's say, the operator controller when the PR is made, and then the test PRs rely on that image, and they, swap out that sub component with the content in the PR. So that's not part of the second or milestone. That's just a long-term thing I was thinking about possibly doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I've got some other thoughts on that, but it'd be something that I can delve on later. I don't want to take up too much time specifically about this stuff.
Yeah,
And they're kind of half-formed thoughts anyways.
yeah, and all that stuff I just blurted out, explained, but I think that like those are half-formed thoughts as well. Like again, it's up to the, we'll decide if we want to go down that path and working on that, as a team. Cool. So on that note, I am going to create a GitHub issue in the background, and maybe we can continue discussion there. So we can refine this and we can start generating the issues associated with each of these. How's that sound to everyone?
Sounds good to me.
Cool. Okay. I think on that note, I'm handing it off to Anik to take on milestone 2B.
Yeah. Do you want to share this? Because you're already sharing. Do you already have it?
I'll just drop it so that you have control and can lead at your pace.
All right, give me some time then to figure out the sharing process.
Sorry about that. If you want me to share, I can share.
No, that's fine. I think let's try to quickly like time box this technical process for 2 minutes. If it doesn't happen in 2 minutes, then we'll just get you to share it. All right, where's the share your screen button? I don't actually see a share screen button. Do you know if a non-host can share your screen?
You should be able to, but I will just share.
Oh, I see it. I see it.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, cool. You guys can see it, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I did get a chance a little bit before this meeting to work on this a little bit, but I think it's worth going through this a little bit, and I'm guessing that I did miss out on some things. So maybe it'll be good to clarify that. Just to kind of get everybody on the page of what changes I made. I'll just go through the catalog source story. So first of all, I think this 2B story was it talked about integration OLM v1 catalog source. I was under the impression that that was already talked about in milestone 1, but if that's not the like, for example, I changed this was written as integration and integration or integration of OLM v1 catalog source. The reason that I say that is because in milestone 2, I think it'll be good to keep it contained, at least in terms of the OLM v1 catalog source stories, to bootstrapping processes instead of focusing on or blowing the scope out by talking about integration with the other components that are being developed. But we know that there is parallel work going on for integrating registry v1 catalog sources, which is the current catalog sources with DEPI. So I don't know if you want to capture that also in this 2B, or if that's being talked about somewhere else.
I had just planned to kind of keep it all together because there's some like DEPI changes that needed to happen, and it would be nice to have. So at the end of milestone 1, we're going to have hard-coded entity list that we resolve against, and there's like a step instead of using a hard-coded list, pull out stuff from a registry v1 catalog source. And so that's why we had kind of included it, because we wanted to do that next. And then the idea was we need something that we can actually deploy to a cluster and work against, and we didn't want to be prevented from making those changes until the new catalog sources API is developed. So it was just so that in the interest that when you get your OLM v1 catalog source to a point that you're ready to test it with DEPI and the operator controller, we would have ideally by this point made it such that you can just spin up a like the in progress OLM v1 milestone 2 product, and then make sure that it works with your new catalog source, rather than getting to the point where you have the new catalog source and then trying to make it work with the controller.
Okay. So here's what we can do. I mean, the reason that I say that is because we are still, for example, okay, let's go through what I have for the v1 catalog sources, right? I think milestone 2, I'd like to focus on making sure that we are bootstrapping the v1 catalog source project, and that involves, if I can find where it is, right? So we need to sort of have design discussions. One is the design discussion on the architecture of the v1 catalog source that we've already been having. So I think we need to finalize that, and by that I mean we have a few POCs in flight right now. So we'll need to get that work towards a place where we've finalized and come to a design where we are all sort of have at least lazy consensus, so that we can start bootstrapping the repository that earlier on you showed that you had a placeholder for, Alex. So that is one design discussion that we need to finalize. And then we've recently also started off this design discussion talks about, like I said, release. Okay, just to give you a context, today we ship around bundle images, and we package. We have something called the CSV, and we've got CRDs inside that bundle image, and we've been shipping around these manifests inside container images. But for OLM v1, I think we've started to have conversations about how can we get there's a lot of tech debts in that that we've been talking about for a while to get rid of, and it seems like this is like the most opportune moment for us to talk about starting off fresh and making sure that in OLM v1, when you create a bundle, or when you package your operator as an operator author, when you package your operator for OLM to have them lifecycled by OLM, you will hopefully not have to see that any tech debt carried over from OLM v0. So those discussions, I think we'll need to start off. And I haven't linked any HackMD yet because I'm in the process of sort of writing that design doc right now. But as part of milestone 2, I think it'll be enough for us to say that, okay, we'll start the discussions on that. And that itself has a fair bit of things to talk about. So I think for milestone 2, I want to just keep this scope to, okay, we'll just start the discussion. But also once the design is finalized, since this is like a rough draft, and we haven't started creating an issue, at least we can start off with, we'll just have the repository created, bootstrapped, and I know there's this example of this project template, but this user controller runtime template to use to bootstrap controller projects. I'm not sure which direction we'll still go through, but we might go through, for example, with the custom API direction. So we might have to look at how this process will look like, but at least this is good enough for a placeholder. So that's the sort of work. I think that'll be a lot for us. This will be enough for us for milestone 2 in terms of v1 catalog sources. I wanted to sort of keep the integration with Depi, that, okay, you have a v1 catalog source, and now you can, with the operator controller can query for resources from v1 catalog sources and install an operator, or Depi can query for resources for milestone 3. But with what Alex you just said, does it make sense for us to then just say Depi improvements, integration with current catalog sources? Does that make sense for v2, milestone 2?
Yeah, I think I mean that aligns with what I kind of envisioned we'd get to in this milestone, but if anybody else has a different opinion, please speak up. Okay, I'm gonna assume that could we get any affirmation that this seems to be what we want to do? I got a thumbs up from Catherine, so that looks pretty good for me.
Okay. So that means that we'll need another section over here that says Depi integration with V0 catalog sources. Yeah, so okay, so this as a OLM V1 user, I'd like to install an operator at a specific version. So doesn't this go into the integration story then? Oh, wait, from a catalog source, I think.
So it doesn't need to, we can hard code it, right? Like you could do those independently of using registry V1 catalog sources, because we can just write the JSON response to have, a version. And then we can just write tests that are based on it. So we actually already have this basically done. So it's a DEPI improvement story. And then so the version thing is kind of just, yeah, you've got it. So like DEPI integration, this DEPI integration story revolves around like updating, like writing, Barsha has a very nice proof of concept that kind of showcases this, but it's about watching a bunch of catalog sources on cluster, feeding events to what is effectively a small controller. It reconciles those catalog sources. It then prints all the stuff it finds in those catalog sources to a cache, and then it just feeds that into DEPI. So that's all what the DEPI integration with catalog V0 needs to do. And we could probably link that prototype. Barsha, could you share that link?
Yeah, I'll share that link in a minute. I just wanted to add one thing to it. So right now the prototype doesn't have a catalog source controller as such. The process involves having a cache. It watches for any changes in the catalog source, updates the cache, and then we have this operator controller which looks at the cache, gets stuff from catalog source using gRPC and does whatever we need to do. One of the story in this would be to improve the current POC and design in such a way that tomorrow, if the catalog source changes, for example, from V0, we bring in a V1 design, we make the whole catalog source controller external so that we don't have to make changes in operator controller, but it's kind of like a plug-in mechanism where we can change the implementation of the catalog source and we have rest of the things kind of as it is.
Yeah, so that is a very good point. I mean, I have I think follow-up questions from that, just to make sure that I understand everything that you just said, Varsha. But yeah, it makes sense for us to think about this integration with V0 catalog source as a stopgap measure till V1 catalog source is ready. So it makes sense for us to think about how it makes sense for us to make sure that when we do migrate from V0 to V1 catalog sources, it's not too much work, and therefore this work becomes a lot to consume at this point of time. And having said that, I think you just mentioned something that in line with that, I wasn't too clear on what exactly you mentioned about catalog source controller consumption. Is that, do you mean the product of, so I was under the impression that there's an adapter sitting between the current catalog source and then DEPI that sort of, so and the adapter queries for example, the registry pods to get the bundles that creates the entities. But then if the V1 catalog source is ready, that adapter can, instead of querying the list bundle gRPC endpoint APIs, can just query, for example, if there are new CRs, it can just look for those CRs and watch for those CRs and still create the entity for DEPI. But then it's just the consumption mechanism of that information will have to be switched out. Is that in line with what you were thinking too, Varsha?
Yeah, so right now, all the process which you just said, Anik, is integrated in DEPI as a library, and Ankita has a PR for that to get merged. But the eventual idea would that would be to take that out of the DEPI project, put that somewhere in operator controller. And my idea was to have a separate controller itself, like a separate controller and time kind of controller project, and then kind of a channel which holds the resources. But then that's kind of a design discussion. So it'll be nice to just like have that as one of the issue, and then we have design discussions related to that, and further go ahead on how we would like the adapter to be plugged in.
Okay, that makes sense. Um,
It may make sense just to ask Varsha to fill that all out, out of sync on the meeting, so that we can kind of use this meeting to agree on general, the general direction of the milestone, right? So we can get into the nitty gritty details with Varsha doing that out of sync, and then we can review what the proposed changes are on this document later.
Yep, that makes sense. I'll
Okay.
add a few things to the proposal after the meeting.
Yeah,
So-
and this is just in an effort to kind of push us towards doing stuff out of sync in general, right? Like I think if we can generate all the content that we want to work on, on our own pace, and then like use this meeting to propose what we ultimately want to do, that and solicit feedback, that suddenly we're not locked to a cadence where every week we have 1 hour where we can talk about what we're going to develop next. Because I don't think we'll be able, with the scope of the milestones being as small as they are, I would be concerned that we would get to a point where we complete all our work and we don't have enough content for people to grab, if that makes sense, if we do it all generated in this meeting now.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Cool. Then I'll just leave this kind of point over here as, a placeholder for Varsha to fill out. I guess another placeholder to create would then be, so we've got the DEPI. I'm guessing we already talked about DEPI last week. So I'm just gonna create this other placeholder that says, V0 Calc source integration with DEPI. And then I think the user stories, Alex, you had this from an OLM V0 Calc source. So I think that could be one of the user stories. V0, just so that there. So does that now look much better? So now we've got 3 goals separated out: DEPI improvements, V0 Calc source integration with DEPI, and then bootstrapping V1 Calc sources. For Calc source V1 will just bootstrap, finalize the design discussions and bootstrap for the architecture of the implementation of Calc sources. And then parallelly, we'll be working on integration with V0 Calc sources for DEPI. And then there is a placeholder for that design discussion about what the adapter will look like and how will we switch out the V0 with the V1 when V1 is ready. Does that make sense to everybody as an overall plan?
Yep. And I do think there's a world where we probably have to support the existing registry ones for a while, right? Like ideally, we can handle both cases, but I agree with you, like making it super easy for people to get from registry V1 to the new OLM V1 catalog source is absolutely ideal.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point too, because as you can see, we're already talking about, there is one school of thought which says, okay, we'll be maintaining some sort of backward compatibility with all of the bundles and the packages that are created out in the wild right now in production. And there's another school of thought that says, we'll just build out OLM V1 as if none of the tech debt has to be carried over from OLM v0. But if that happens, then what happens to the existing operator authors and the existing production catalogs that are out there? So while we are sort of deciding on which school of thought we ultimately end up with, excuse me, I think it's safe to say that, okay, there will be a world where we will be supporting v0 catalog sources, or we will need to support v0 catalog sources for a while before we migrate over to v1 catalog sources.
Yep, and I think that will just be a discussion point probably in a following milestone when we're like, okay, what is our support guarantee, right?
Right. And that'll depend a lot on the implementation of v1 catalog sources.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I think that's all I had, unless someone wanted to discuss. Anyone wants to discuss anything else regarding this 2B milestone? Again, I think we've already discussed DEPI last week. Alex, are you happy with what this one looks like now?
Yeah, I think we'd have, there's some general cleanup we can probably do, but I think I'm in agreement that this is what we'll be doing in the next milestone in terms of DEPI improvements and the stuff we need to do in the catalog source world.
Cool. Then I'll stop sharing and I'll give the mic over to you, Alex.
I am going to drop that mic and let everybody leave 5 minutes early unless there's something anyone wants to discuss.
Nice.
Okie dokie. On that note, thank you everybody for being here and for being engaging, providing feedback, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye for now.